More than 10 armored vehicles, about 15 cars, several tanks, and 5 artillery systems were destroyed in the Southern Slobozhansky direction by the warriors of the Scythian Brigade of the National Guard of Ukraine. In addition, the defenders destroyed several Russian radar stations, ammunition depots, and struck enemy troop concentrations and dugouts. Meanwhile, in the Lyman direction, the aggressor launched attacks in the areas of the settlements of Rekidub, Karpitka, and Novoselivka. In the Pokrovsk sector, intense fighting took place near Nikonarivka, Rodinsk, Kotlin, Molodetsk, Novopavlivka, Novoeconomic, and Myrnograd. And on the Oleksandrivka section of the front, the defense forces repelled Russian assaults near Novoselivka, Sosnivka, Stepov, Ribn, Novohrihorivka, as well as Vishnev.
The enemy can't effectively deploy large reserves or operate very efficiently in terms of advancing. On one hand, we strike them with artillery and drone attacks, and on the other hand, it's hard for them to move along the front line. That's why they're our objective, indicators that the enemy is bogged down. And on the other hand, of course, it's tough for us to work against them there as well. But right now, there aren't any breakthroughs like the enemy keeps reporting in their official channels. So, we still mainly control the situation with our firepower. And of course, we carry out specific special operations to neutralize these infiltration groups.
Meanwhile, the Russian dictator Putin made a statement claiming that Ukrainian troops are supposedly blocked in Kupiansk and Pokrovsk. And the Russian armed forces are allegedly ready to let media representatives, including Ukrainian and foreign journalists, into these so-called encirclement zones so they can supposedly see for themselves what's happening there. The armed forces of Ukraine refuted the statement of the Kremlin dictator, calling it fiction and fantasy. According to the Ukrainian military, not even Putin's loyal audience will believe this lie. Ukrainian soldiers noted that heavy fighting is taking place in the areas around Kupiansk and Pokrovsk. The invaders are merely trying to break into the settlements and gain a foothold there. And the flag that the Russians hung on the steel at the entrance to Pokrovsk stayed there for less than an hour.
For President Vladimir Putin, every single city is considered to be absolutely crucial and essential in terms of demonstrating and showcasing the supposed might and strength of the Russian army, the so-called might of the Russian army. As a result, they are very actively using their own personnel as suicide squads, having them dress up as civilians and risk their lives to reach certain locations, slip between the defense forces, and plant a Russian flag, just for show, film it all with a Mavic drone that flies in, and then declare that this particular area is definitely under their troops' control. But in reality, this bravado and this information do not reflect the truth. Putin needs this so that he can show that his words, when he says, "Oh, we're about to conquer Ukraine," do not match his actual actions or his real capabilities.
Footage of combat operations in the Konstantinovka direction was shared by the soldiers of the 28th Separate Brigade named after the Knights of the Winter Campaign. With the help of drones, they detect and precisely destroy enemy equipment. In particular, FPV drones burned several cannons that the Russian occupiers tried to camouflage, as well as shelters for the occupiers' personnel along with their infantry. Agents of the partisan movement Atesh set fire to a relay cabinet in temporarily occupied Tokmak in the Zaporizhia region. It provided the Russians with control over train movements on a critically important route. The Russian occupiers used this railway junction to transfer military equipment, ammunition, and personnel to the Zaporizhia direction. The sabotage disrupted the schedule of military shipments and will complicate the maneuvering of Russian troops. Defense Forces drones struck a Panzer S-2 air defense missile system, 2 oil depots, and 2 Russian radar stations in temporarily occupied Crimea. And in the past 24 hours, Defense Forces eliminated 1,150 Russian occupiers. Thus, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russia's total combat losses since the start of the full-scale war have almost reached 1,140,000 people. In addition, yesterday, Defense Forces destroyed 4 Russian tanks, 3 armored vehicles, and 20 artillery systems. Also destroyed were one Russian multiple rocket launcher system and 81 units of enemy vehicles and special equipment.
And to go into more detail, we'll start our conversation with the Pokrovsk Myrnograd agglomeration, with Serhiy Bratchuk, the spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, who is joining us now. Serhiy, we're glad to have you with us. Glory to Ukraine.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Glory to the heroes. Glory to all defenders.
Serhiy, Pokrovsk week. For 2 months watched as that very Dobropilya breakthrough. Well, I won't use that word. Let's say infiltration was happening. It was eliminated, and now the elimination of those infiltrated saboteurs is still ongoing, and so on. Can we say that the situation in Pokrovsk in some way also resembles this kind of infiltration? And what do the Ukrainian Defense Forces need in order to achieve the same result in Pokrovsk as they did in the Dobropilya direction?
Well, actually, what unites these two locations? The enemy's tactic really is infiltration, what we call today the gathering of all those forces that slip through our combat lines into a single mass. Because the enemy's tactic is to bypass our positions, and recently they've even started bypassing populated areas, and on different fronts too, including creating so-called pockets in order to later try to eliminate them. So, this tactic is really common for, probably, everyone. Sections of the front, the large Russian-Ukrainian front. As for Pokrovsk and the Dobropilya direction, there is still a difference here. Because when we talk about Pokrovsk, we mean a single agglomeration, a single populated area, whereas in the Dobropilya direction, there are several settlements that the enemy tried to pass through, and they managed to achieve something there. And today we really see how our defense forces, including Azov and the assault troops, are operating. These are all the attached forces and resources working in this direction. That so-called cardboard bunny, the not-so-funny one we all saw on the maps, is being destroyed today. Basically, we're talking about what's happening with the enemy there. Today, the situation is not the best, but at the same time, the Russians are even trying to carry out offensive actions, but that's understandable because the command demands results. In fact, results are also required in Pokrovsk. As for the directions here, unfortunately, the southern and southwestern plans for Pokrovsk haven't exactly failed. Yes, because in any case, I don't want to use exactly those words. Our defenders, our brothers in arms, are there, and there is a representative of the Ukrainian Volunteer Army. Today, they are making every possible effort to prevent the enemy from advancing, to stop the forces that have been thrown in. And let me remind you, that's the 51st Army in general, and the 2nd Combined Arms Army. These are attached battalion brigades, regiments, including tank units, that are trying to take control of this settlement. Yes, in fact, attempts to start street fighting in certain locations in Pokrovsk. Unfortunately, the enemy really did succeed there. Indeed, the same kind of buildup happened. And as we once discussed on our broadcasts, one of the main objectives of the Russians along the entire front, in all our major settlements, is to enter these populated areas and specifically to start urban combat. And as we can see, this is a top priority for the Russians. In some parts of Pokrovsk, in certain locations, they have achieved this goal. Today, the situation is indeed very difficult. Today, we fully understand that the command has taken extraordinary measures, made very important decisions in order to try to stabilize the situation, or at least to see some signs of improvement. It's probably not about stabilization yet. It's too early and doesn't make sense to talk about that today, but at least to stop the Russian troops so they don't advance further. The situation is tough, but in any case, as of today, when we talk about the chances, whether there is a chance to hold on to Kupiansk to prevent the enemy from occupying it, this is my personal opinion, but today, such chances do exist. And it is at these very moments that Ukrainian history is being written, military history. I sincerely hope that this history will, in the end, have a truly positive and uplifting ending for all of us involved.
Sergei, Do you agree with the idea that the main goal of the Russian army is to create the appearance that they have surrounded Pokrovsk? This was reported by the commander of the 429th Separate Regiment of Unmanned Systems, Achilles, in the active troops of the self-propelled guns, Yuri Fedorenko. It was broadcast on the Freedom TV channel. According to him, the defense forces are detecting and eliminating the invaders in a timely manner. Let's listen.
They are planning, in full measure, to destroy Ukrainian statehood, to destroy us as the bearers of this statehood. In other words, to destroy the Ukrainian people. The stages of occupation are prioritized for them above all. The key battles are currently taking place in the Donetsk region, but at the same time, the enemy is active in the Kharkiv region, terrorizing the local population in the Kherson region. And in the Zaporizhia region, the enemy is more than just active. As a result, the enemy will continue its offensive actions. And right now, it is very important for all of us, I mean both the citizens of Ukraine and those countries that are helping us, whether financially or with their weapons, to understand that the only thing that can stop Putin and break him is funding the defense forces, so they can hold him at the front lines of combat. And these are technologies, advanced technologies, that should help us secure our Ukrainian skies. These are air defense systems, both stationary and portable. This is funding for drones. And of course, it is the ability to obtain those types of weapons that will allow us to operate on the territory of the Russian Federation against legitimate military targets.
Putin is not ready to make compromises. We can see that, and American intelligence confirms it. What is he doing near Pokrovsk right now? What are his occupiers doing? How many people has he managed to gather, and what?
What kind of equipment do they have? How strong of a force has Putin assembled?
I would probably add one more factor, which should and definitely can play a role in our resistance to the enemy is the resilience of Ukrainian society. After all, it's no secret that a major information and psychological special operation is being carried out today by the Russian occupiers. This includes hanging those tricolor rags around Pokrovsk. Among other things, we understand perfectly well that those who hung that rag on the Pokrovsk sign are already gone, because literally within an hour they were eliminated, and that tricolor rag is gone too. We understand perfectly well what's happening today. Even the citizen who calls himself the president of the Russian Federation, Citizen Putin, is taking part in this information and psychological operation. You can see that he came out of his bunker. Again, this shows just how important Pokrovsk is as a target for the Russians, and how obviously the enemy is in a hurry today. Because today, we are receiving weapons supplies from Europeans, and our own production is being set up as well. Production of Ukrainian-made weapons is increasing, and strikes on Russian territory are yielding results today. Moreover, these are results that are being felt on the battlefield, and will be felt even more in the future. That's why the enemy is in a hurry. And it is precisely the resilience, the emotional and psychological resilience of the Ukrainian people. Well, you know, I'll take the liberty to say that this is the main factor that will help us endure in this struggle. Because the enemy today, they're throwing a lot of things at us. And obviously, most of the reports about Pokrovsk, Myrnograd, Kupiansk, and Dobrapilya today start with emotional reactions. That's exactly what the enemy is counting on. And when we talk about the efforts, realistically, that the enemy is making today, not just to enter Pokrovsk and fight there, but to completely take over the city, I mentioned how many military units are involved. That is, combined arms armies and tank units are positioned in the Pokrovsk direction. And according to our assessment, about 10,000 enemy reserves have been brought in there. That's why these assaults are happening constantly. And that's how much importance the enemy attaches to this direction in particular. Plus, I should definitely add from an informational standpoint that they're creating the illusion for Russian citizens of some kind of World War II style battle. This is very important for the Putin regime, not just to maintain its legitimacy, but to preserve its power and security. That's why the Russians are in a hurry. A lot of forces have been thrown in, so we really hope that in the next few days the situation will become completely clear. And these shaky scales, which are on the battlefield today, figuratively speaking, of course. They will still tip in our favor, because so much effort has been put in. So much has been done. And do you remember about Pokrovsk? The situation with the Russian deadlines. They were supposed to have a positive outcome for them by the end of last year. Pokrovsk held, is holding, and I hope will continue to be defended. Although it's very difficult to do that today.
Sergei, well, since we're having this kind of conversation, since we're now fighting on the information front, let's talk about Kupiansk as well. That's another city that Putin has surrounded. How serious is the situation there? How much of a threat is there to the logistics of the Ukrainian armed forces on the western bank of the Oskil? And how much of a threat is there to Kupiansk-Возloviak?
Well, actually, it's probably not for nothing that both Kupiansk and Pokrovsk are being mentioned. Putin has linked them together because the enemy's attempts to carry out their plans really do involve encirclement, at least from 3 sides, in order to squeeze these defensive strongholds of ours and then work on, let's say, both capturing them and continuing tactical advances in those directions accordingly. However, regarding Kupiansk, we see that everywhere there is fighting, logistics are at play. We need to talk about this as well. It's difficult today. Delivering the necessary supplies, I'm not even talking about food or essentials, but just getting them to the positions, is still challenging. About Kupiansk, the situation for the enemy is not as Putin describes. There is no encirclement at all. Moreover, the enemy's logistics today, to put it mildly, aren't working very well either, because first of all, the defense forces control certain areas and don't allow the enemy to carry out their logistics. You mentioned the Oskil River. I actually wanted to talk about it, because the crossings that the Russians are trying to set up there are being built and then destroyed by the defense forces. This has been going on, probably, since the very beginning of this Kupiansk offensive operation by the Russian Federation. Our unit also worked in this area last year, and this year as well, carrying out artillery strikes on these routes, on this logistics. So today, yes, the enemy's attempts are focused primarily on Kupiansk-Kozlovoy, because that's the railway. That's exactly about improving their logistics, and also about creating a kind of buffer security zone along the banks of the Oskil for the further advance of Russian troops. There will be a lot more information attacks. We need to be ready for the most unexpected moves by the enemy. They don't know how to handle information. But I think that our society as well is really gradually becoming more mature, so it can process different kinds of information. Once again, today we need to listen to the military, those who speak rationally and clearly, without revealing our plans, of course, but who explain that the enemy is acting with certain forces and has specific objectives. That way, people will perceive the situation differently. Just a little differently, because the Russians, I wouldn't be surprised, tomorrow they'll be measuring their advances in square centimeters. And that's going to happen too, and all of this will be announced by the Bunker Führer. That's why we need to be prepared for anything, including on the information front. We need to support the defense forces. Help is absolutely necessary in every area right now.
Serhiy, there's one more thing. Let's figure this out together. Again, this is also about logistics, but this time regarding the enemy. How significant could the destruction of the Belgorod Dam be? Could it play a decisive role in ensuring the logistical support of Russian troops in the Kharkiv region?
At this moment, right now, as we're talking live, I want to say that this work needs to continue. Because the Russians are trying to restore everything as much as possible, to fill everything in as much as they can, so that the water doesn't flow onto Russian positions and, among other things, doesn't complicate their logistics. That's why it's quite likely that our intelligence is reporting to the relevant commanders, and I hope the appropriate decisions will be made so that, say, a Holy HIMARS comes in with a precision strike, so that the big water flows again. This really does affect the course of combat operations, obviously. So, I hope this work will continue.
Let's talk some more about what's happening in southern Ukraine. We see that the aggressor continues to strike at civilian infrastructure, at energy facilities. But at the same time, Ukraine also has its strengths, like Sebeby, for example. What successes do we have in this area, and how would you describe the situation in southern Ukraine right now?
Well, actually, if you look at the territory of temporarily occupied Crimea, we get news from there every day, and it's often very positive. So, as you remember, just a few days ago, while he's still temporarily alive, the go-lighter of the occupation authorities, Aksionov, announced that the gasoline problem had been solved. And so, early this morning, there were strikes on yet another oil depot, actually 2 of them. It's the same Vardius depot near Simferopol, which was already hit on October 17th. So, the occupiers were clearly too quick to claim that the situation with petroleum products and lubricants was improving. I think after today's strike, it's definitely not getting any better. Actually, if we're talking about it, Sebeby looks great, but I personally prefer the Melyoks. It just sounds better somehow. By the way, the security service is also involved in many of the strikes across the territory of temporarily occupied Crimea. And as for the sea, there are definitely no other unique Melyoks like these in the world. So, continuing about those infrastructure facilities located in Crimea, today a unique anti-aircraft missile and gun system was destroyed by the main intelligence directorate. It was a Panzer S-2. As far as I remember, this is the first time for this particular model, because there have already been S-1S, and more than 30 of those have been destroyed, so that's a new one, a new spore. So, the cleanup in Crimea continues. Let's put it this way, the demilitarization of Crimea. But we understand that if an air defense system is taken out, it's probably to enable the use of other types of firepower against other targets. There are airfields there, military units, and logistics facilities that supply the southern front, including the Pokrovsk front of the Russian-Ukrainian war. That's why the work in Crimea is very active. And as for Sebeby, well, honestly, I think, first of all, there aren't any like that. I'll talk more about this soon. I can't say it'll be in a day or two, but probably, in the near future, we'll be telling you about more successes at sea. Because there haven't been any naval drones with multiple rocket launch systems on board since the Soviet Union. So 4 missiles. They can be launched from each side. It's a spot the enemy doesn't expect. And there will be something to talk about.
Sergei, we have about a minute left. How strong is the enemy group when it comes to advancing along the Kakalka, what used to be a reservoir, towards Zaporizhia?
Today we're talking about how the main efforts are focused on Pokrovsk, but the enemy is trying to pull our forces and reserves toward the Zaporizhia front and get behind the Heliopol group. Again, this is to create conditions for advancing on Pokrovsk from the south, and, accordingly, to establish this buffer security zone. The Russians have announced a major offensive on the city of Zaporizhia, but today it's clear they don't have enough resources. The enemy, that is. But once again, we're coming back to the information front. That's why today there will be a lot of information dumps. So, information hygiene is just as important today. Because with what the Russians are doing in the information space, I think even Goebbels is probably turning over in his grave, if he even has one in hell.
Serhiy, thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your opinion. Serhiy Bratchuk, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, was in touch with our studio.
Subscribe to The Gaze and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.